Hello, and welcome to We Speak CVE, a free podcast from the CVE program. On this podcast, we'll talk with people from the cybersecurity community about what else, cybersecurity and vulnerability management, and the CVE catalog of vulnerabilities. If you didn't know, the CVE program's mission is to identify, define, and catalog publicly disclosed cybersecurity vulnerabilities.
Hello and welcome to the CVE podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Sabens, and a CVE board member. I have a couple other CVE board members with me today. We're wanting to talk to you about CVE rules, revisions, and changes. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Art, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hey, Shannon. Good to be here again. Thanks for hosting us. And my name is Art Manion. I'm a CVE board member, and I, for better or worse, volunteered maybe a year ago to edit the CNA operational rules revision, which has just recently passed the board vote. So I'm very interested in helping everyone understand sort of the changes and what happened, and happy to chat today. Thanks.
Thanks for coming. Hey, Kent, introduce yourself.
Sure, and I'm Kent Landfield, also a CVE board member and chair of the SPWG, person responsible for getting quality talent to help edit the rules revision document, and Art did an outstanding job being that editor. Look forward to talking about this today.
Great. You know, this is version 4 of the rules, and this one has been some time coming. We've spent quite a lot of time in looking at the rules and socializing rules changes, and now we have, a version 4 that has passed, and we're rolling that out. So tell me a little bit about, I guess I'll start broadly, what was the approach to the changes? And then we can get into what some of the changes were.
Let me start here. We began the rule changes a few years ago, actually. It was, I think the official note of discussion was mid-2022. I think it may have been even earlier than that. A lot of discussions have happened through that period. As Art mentioned, I think it was March of 2023 that he stepped up and volunteered to sort of accelerate the rule changes and drive the discussions and make the, own the document for the actual edits as the SPWG document editor, so to speak. And since then, we have had some quite a bit of intense conversations about all of the situations that at least we could envision and imagine. I'm sure we missed quite a few, but from a standpoint of the rules and how the CNA assignments and governance for CNAs are supposed to move forward, this was sort of a white paper kind of, blank sheet of paper kind of approach to recreating the rules from scratch. We leaned on what we've known and what we've done and learned from the past, but it really was a lot of discussions around how can we get to the right place so that we don't have to do this again. We want rules to be stable and moving forward. We've been working under the 3.0 rules since I think 2020, early 2020, and it was time. They were a little long in the tooth, and they weren't really set up to evolve with the program. And we think we're in a good place now, both from a program perspective and a technology perspective. Art?
Yeah. So I can pick things up, at least in that March 23 time frame. So I participate in the strategic planning working group that Kent chairs, and we were working on the rules, but as one might imagine, right, sort of a volunteer working group, concerned board members, a fairly important document for the program. We really did need someone to edit. I did volunteer, but there needed to be an editor, someone sort of holding the pen, a little bit more process. We actually sort of doubled or tripled the amount of time we were spending together to get through the revisions. We started off with the original document and tried to edit it. I think that pretty quickly became untenable, and we eventually kind of rewrote almost everything. Some rules are carried forward. We'll talk about that, but a lot of the text really got touched. You're not going to be able to do a 3.0 to 4.0 comparison, word for word, line for line very easily. And we did try. We didn't have an existing documented process, but we did try really hard. All these discussions and SPWG and board member discussions, we did try to make sure we were including the people who are going to have to live by these rules, primarily the CNAs. So we had representation throughout the process, but we also had 2 open comment periods. One for CVE program members, largely CNAs, and a second open public comment period. So one of the things we did in our process was try to have open comments and work through those, and those just take time. But we have the idea of trying to be transparent, trying to show people what happened, trying to give stakeholders a say in the rules, and balance that with actually then getting the rules finished and doing what's best for the program overall.
And you said something interesting, which is, the notion of modernizing the program and having rules that take the program forward. One of the things that struck me about the rules is an attempt to be technology neutral. Tell me a little bit of, one of the questions we've had more recently is, what about AI? What about this? What about that? But especially, what about AI? Talk to me a little bit about how and why, we want to be technology neutral with the rules about vulnerability and CVE assignment.
All right. So when we started with the discussion about redoing the rules, cloud technologies and services were a sort of a thorn on a lot of folks' sides. They didn't quite understand how we could deal with issuing cloud-related vulnerability assignments, and it was really important to us that we try to first off address cloud. So we did create a small subgroup of folks that went through trying to get some general foundational understanding as to how that might work. We did talk with cloud providers, large cloud providers, about how this would impact their practices and what their approaches were. Very, very informative, very, very useful. But as we were going through, and this was really just post March 23, we started to look at it not just from a cloud and services perspective. The first set of rules, the 3.0 version, really didn't do a good job with, for all intent and purposes. We started to look at the cloud rule that we had sort of come up with, which is a set of characteristics and attributes about when to assign. And we started to see that, and this was driven by Art with a really interesting table that he wrote up about possibilities, decision matrix, so to speak. And that sort of led us down the primrose path of getting to a technology neutral kind of approach. At the same time, over the last few years, AI is becoming more and more apparent, and generative AI sort of blasted onto the scene, and everybody's rushing to the hype. But the reality is AI is here. It's going to be here going forward. And we wanted to make sure that regardless of what kind of technology was coming, we would have at least some foundation within the rules to be able to evolve to address those types of issues without having to blanket restart rewriting rules, which is not something we want to do. Now, granted, I don't think we got it perfect, and I'm sure there's something down the road that will cause us some consternation. But the reality is, I think for the most part, from the standpoint of addressing evolving technologies, the program's in a reasonably good position foundationally with a new set of rules.
So, Kent mentioned this back from the 3.0 rules timeframe. Cloud was, I wouldn't say new at the time, but new enough to the CVE program and to CVE assignment decisions that we had some cautious handling of CVE assignments for cloud and the 3.0 rules. And Kent reminded me of I don't know how many months we spent looking at some of those tables. But what it really got down to is, what are the foundational reasons to have a CVE assignment and a CVE record? And what's necessary to have those? And, ask ourselves a bunch of questions in table form at some points and really try to tease out, did a specific type of technology really make a difference or affect the decision to assign or not? And we pretty much worked ourselves into a situation where we don't think so. If a vulnerability is public, there's sufficient evidence of a vulnerability, and that's its own conversation. And it is public, the program would like to have a CVE ID for it, because now we can talk about that abstract thing, and we have an ID, and Shannon and Kent and I know what we're talking about if we talk about a specific ID. Now, that said, there are, emerging technologies. AI, right, is something new on the scene. The CVE program and the board have recently talked about, does AI as a technology mean something different for CVE assignments? And I think that the general picture, and looking over time, right, there's always going to be a new technology. And the rules this version are a little more explicit about the fact that things could change. There will be new technology. There will be new sort of norms about what are considered to be vulnerabilities or not as time goes on. And the rules say that the program actually must be flexible, must adapt when these things come along. And once there's some consensus or decision reached, must write it down in the rules if it's that firm of a decision. But overall, and there was a whole lot of work done by an even smaller subgroup on the cloud technology question. The consensus and the new rules say that technology alone is not a reason to assign or not assign a CVE ID. One might consider technology, but it's not the sole reason for making a different decision. And we think this is a longer lasting, sort of sufficiently general rule that will help the program down the road.
Good. I totally agree. And I'm really happy with this approach. So one of the things that interested me about the rules, and that I thought listeners to the podcast would be interested in, was the right of refusal. And I'd like to talk about the right of refusal and the notion that, it's okay not to fix it, but it still needs a CVE. And so, what does that chain look like where we see a vendor that may or may not apply a CVE, but we generally agree we have a vulnerability? What does that look like?
Yeah, from the standpoint of the program, we've always had a general guiding principle that those who own the scope of the problem, which may be a vendor or open source project, they get first right of refusal on assignment for the most part, because they're the ones that, for all intent and purposes, need to fix it, need to provide the security advisory, need to make that happen. Now, that's first right is indicative of the fact that the program really believes that no vendor, no software publisher should block or try to block the release of a vulnerability if we believe there is in fact a vulnerability. So they get the first right to actually go through, do the research, say, yeah, there's a vulnerability, we're going to go issue a CVE for it, or to do that themselves. and then go from there. But if they decide that it is not something they want to do for whatever reason, whether it be a business reason or a disagreement for all intent and purposes, which has happened in the past with the reporter, then the program has the right to issue a vulnerability assignment, a CVE ID for that anyway, a CNA of last resort, and in essence override the vendor or the publisher. They can't stop one, but they get the first right of refusal to say, no, we're not going to assign, somebody else can. That's fine. That's great. But they can't stop the assignment if, in fact, there's reasonable evidence, reasonable proof that in fact there is a vulnerability there.
Yeah, I was I don't know, happy to have come across this right of first refusal term. You'll find it in some contract law in the US at least. But the idea, as Kent said, is pretty straightforward, right? The party, in this case, the CNA with the best scope, which very often would be the supplier or vendor CNA, if the supplier or vendor of the software in question is in fact a CNA, gets the first dibs, basically. And to Kent's point, this has been the case previously. There were a couple of sort of processes through the 3.0 rules where it could appear that, right, the CNA with the best scopes refusal to act or acknowledge or respond really could slow down an assignment or even prevent one, even though that was not explicitly what the rules, right, allowed or said. So similar to the technology agnostic, framework or framing, we think this is going to be a long-lasting and hopefully broadly applicable rule. We think this is the right level to write the CNA rules at. Best scope always gets first dibs. If something doesn't happen, other CNAs with appropriate scope can step in and act. And, Kent mentioned, right, end of life is a reason someone might not assign, right? This software is no longer supported. Don't expect a fix. Perfectly valid response. No worries whatsoever. We've got some CNAs who already declare that they don't assign CVE IDs for sort of lower severity, lower risk vulnerabilities. Again, that's perfectly permitted, but it doesn't prevent the program from assigning a CVE for that issue. It just means that vendor or supplier CNA with the best scope has passed on that right of first refusal, and then other CNAs, such as a CNA LR, a last resort CNA, can step in.
So I think a lot of our listeners are interested in the program support for end of life or end of support. Obviously, right of refusal has an impact there. Are there any other changes to end of life or end of support in the new CVE rules?
I don't think there's really what I would call changes to end of life assignment processes. I think that's a documented process the program has had for a couple years now. And the key here is that it is an established set of policy and rules for how to deal with it with end of life. But what's been sort of the way we did this in the 3.0 rules was very different than how we did it in the 4.0 rules. In the 3.0 rules, they duplicated text everywhere. We're trying to make this a much easier focus from a standpoint of being able to reference external documents. So in the new rules, we link out, so to speak, to the program's end of life assignment process document.
I don't have much to add to that. No real changes to end of life. The new rules are a little more explicit about tagging things properly, for example, when there's an end of life assignment. But again, this I mentioned it. The first refusal idea. There's the potential that I think we're going to have an end of life policy anyway, and some guidance for end of life. But in some sense, end of life is one of any number of reasons that a CNA may opt not to assign. And again, that choice is up to the CNA. However, the end of life policy and the first refusal policy both lead to an assignment still being possible. I'll just interject one tidbit. This came up a lot during our conversations and our deliberations, that the CVE identifies a vulnerability. And of course, we all are hoping that, right, that information includes, how do I fix it? Where's the patch? Where's the update? What do I do? However, not all vulnerabilities receive patches or fixes or updates, perhaps because the product is end of life. And CVE does not identify a fix or a patch. CVE identifies a vulnerability. So I will state that, because that's something that day to day, I think lots of people, myself included, lose sight of.
I'm really glad you said that. I totally agree. People tend to equate the CVE and the patch. Again, CVE is for the vulnerability, not the patch. So I'm glad you said that. Another change, or another potential change that I wanted to ask you about, that we may see related to, or our listeners may be curious about in the same context as right of refusal or end of life. Are there any changes to the CVE's dispute process? Did anything change there? And some of our listeners may not know that we have a dispute process. So I'll open it to Art and Kent to talk about the dispute process and any potential changes there.
I'll let Art take this one.
I was expecting you to take that one first, Kent. Yeah, so Kent's mentioned this, but we have, for this size organization, maybe not surprisingly, more than one policy, rules, guidance document. So there is a separate document that handles and describes the dispute resolution policy. That is on our list to review and possibly revise very soon, now that the CNA, the main rules document, is in place or finished. So the CNA rules document doesn't really specify any changes to the dispute resolution process. Again, separate document. There are, when do people care about disputes? When they're arguing and disagreeing about something. So definitely a hot topic. I suspect that we will be taking a look at the dispute policy soon. I don't think there are major changes to the overall rules that drive the dispute resolution, changes to the dispute policy. But like the rest of our rules, I think it's time for taking a look at that. I will just say personally, I'm of the opinion that I think it is possible and will help if we can, in some sense, make the dispute resolution process lighter weight or decrease friction. There's still going to be a dispute. There still might be disagreements and feelings involved, of course. But right, we fairly large program, quarter million records in the database, and at least 25,000 a year. Some are going to be disputed. We accept that, and that's fine. How can we fairly and with the least amount of overhead, note, be transparent about, hopefully resolve disputes or communicate that things are disputed at least. So I think that's going to get a looking at, but nothing in the main rules really touched on the current dispute process.
Yeah, I think in a lot of respects, one of the things that we've been trying to do, and Art did a really good job, as far as I'm concerned, from this CNA, operational CNA rules assignment document, is that we as a program have been using terms rather loosely. Granted, this is a program that over time has been evolving, and these documents are written by a bunch of different people. It's important that we have a consistent language, consistent set of definitions, consistent set of terms that are used across the board. I do expect and can guarantee is going to happen. We'll be looking at the end of life and the dispute process from the standpoint of, okay, regardless of the processes, we're trying to be consistent with our wording. So we'll be changing some of the wording to match the approved definitions the program wants to use across the board. That's coming. But we did do that. Art did do that in this document. So we are using a consistent set of terms going forward.
Oh yeah, how could I have forgotten? We found many of our documents had glossaries at the end of the document, and they sometimes aligned and sometimes did not. So the plan is straightforward: have a centralized single glossary that the entire program uses and references. And yes, on our path to updating the CNA rules, we made a bunch of glossary updates, and those are on the website. The official glossary is simply on cve.org. So all the terms are there. If you are reading the rules carefully, I do recommend there are some terms where the definition is going to matter as to how you interpret the rule. So do pay attention to proper noun capitalized terms that we define in the glossary. There's a good chance we are taking a regular English word and having a slightly special definition for our use in the program.
So there's something else I wanted to ask, and that is, let's say for our CNA listeners, our listeners who are participating in the program as CNAs, first question is, will I have any difficulties, or what challenges might I have in coming into, compliance or adopting the new rules? And then if there are any challenges, around adopting the new rules that you think might affect me, how much time do I have to adopt the new rules as a CNA?
I do not think there's a lot of impact here. I think there's a lot of clarity. Rules that in the past were understood because of common operations are now put on paper so people can understand them and not have to have the experience to do it right, so to speak. So I do think that in a lot of respects, it's not going to be as big an impact as you would think from something that was sort of started from a blank sheet of paper. This is the rules themselves will be in effect. The 4.0 rules will be in effect starting August the 8th. We're giving the CNA community basically a 3-month time frame to get familiar with the rules, look at their own processes, see if there's things that they need to be doing differently, which I don't think is going to be a major impact. But if you have automation, there may be some other considerations. So we wanted to make sure we gave folks enough time to have that analysis, to see what that impact might be, and to be able to get themselves in a place where on August the 8th of 2024, they're ready to hit the ground running with the new rules.
Yep, Kent hit it. The short answer is there's about a 90-day period before the rules are in effect. And to disagree slightly with Kent, it doesn't affect me directly, but I have heard some CNAs state that they do appreciate and may indeed need and make use of that time period. And the one example I've heard is that the change in the cloud assignment rules could impact some CNAs, and they want to be ready to be able to handle requests or make assignments for cloud services more than they were doing in the past under the 3.0 rules. So that's one possible, rule change that might take up resources or effort from CNAs. After a 2-year process, I was anxious to ship the approved rules, but 90 more days isn't going to kill anything, and it is a sort of a slow, cautious approach. So hopefully nobody can yell at us for not giving ample warning, opportunity to be involved in the process.
Yeah, that's important. We did make sure that this was, there were comment periods. So along the way, the CNA community has been able to see and contribute comments, and did. So thanks to them for doing that. It was very useful to get their input and comments. But I to the cloud point, yes, I agree that definitely is one where you're adding more capabilities as opposed to actually changing existing processes. And hopefully they don't have to change a lot of existing processes. They may have some additive processes that they're going to be assigning for AI, ML, or for cloud. So yes, agree.
Well, what I love about this so much is what you said about providing a lot of clarity without adding, any additional burden to, the CNAs to comply with the program rules. So I'm really, really excited about that. I'd like to, we were running out of time, but I'd like to give you one parting comment. Do you want to talk very briefly about CVE record enrichment and what's coming there?
Well, yes, I do actually. CVE has made a decision a few years ago. It has taken us a while to get some of the automation in place, to get an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. But the program believes that the best time to get information about a vulnerability is when the vendor publisher is actually writing their security advisories, actually making the CV assignment initially. It's fresh in their mind. There's a lot of good work that's gone on to get them to the point where they could push out their CVE, hopefully with a patch, but again, their assignment itself. And having that information made available to the CV program makes it easier for the whole vulnerability management community to benefit from that. We have in the past not required a lot of information, and in going forward, we're not requiring additional information, but we're providing the mechanism to allow CNAs to provide that at the time they're doing this, at the time they're making the assignments and publishing their security advisories. This is sort of a transition period where information is being made public, and we want to be able to enable as much of that information to be made public to downstream users of the CV program as possible. In the past, NIST and others have enriched the CV data at some point downstream. We want this information enriched as much as possible by the CNAs, who are the folks really, that are trying to correct a situation. They know the most right then. And we want to enable that information to be made available to others downstream who can then leverage it, use it, and benefit from it. So we're making a push for additional information to be added. The new CVE record format provides that capabilities for things like CVSS 4.0, which is coming up shortly from the standpoint of support for it. And we're also looking at CWE assignments and additional information that just benefits the community at large. So my 2 cents, please do it. I think it's much better for the community itself to have that timelier information and that additional information from the original source of the CVE itself.
Um, I'll just briefly, I generally agree with Kent. I have been, I think, for my entire career with CVE, cautious about, um, I guess I'll say growth, but growth of the data set, growth of what's required, and the idea of a minimal set of core required CVE fields or data elements with optional and perhaps as things are changing, more highly recommended additional information. I have no real issue with, but this sort of comes down to a bit of a philosophical discussion, right? Is CVE laser focused on simply and limitedly identifying a vulnerability, and perhaps do we want to capture other vulnerability information, especially if it's at the fingertips of the CNAs producing the records at the time that they are filing the records? So I am generally on board with what's happening here. I just I do have in the back of my head that one day we might be facing a pile of sort of 5 to 10 years worth of technical debt and lots of fields and lots of data floating around. But I think that can be managed carefully, just so long as we don't try to make CVE the vulnerability database of all things for the entire planet. I don't think that's the right rule for the CVE program, but that's I think still an open question.
Well, I hate that that's all the time we have, but that's all the time we have today. I really want to thank you both so much for coming by and talking about the rules. I hope that people are excited about the changes and that people find the changes, to be not at all both clarifying and not at all intimidating. I think that they will. And I hope you'll both come back to the podcast again soon.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me.
Yep. Thanks for having us, Shannon. Thanks, Kent.
Thank you for joining us today on the We Speak CVE podcast, which is available for free on Buzzsprout and the CVE website. If you'd like to participate or suggest a topic, please contact us on the CVE website.